It was quiet. According to reports, the vehicle had been sitting for days, maybe weeks, parked, unmoving. Just another car on the street. No one expected it to matter. There was no sense of anything out of the ordinary, just an accumulation of parking tickets. Finally, it was slated to tow. The driver hoisted it up, attached it to the back, and drove it to the tow yard. Just another day. But that is when things start to derail. On a completely unrelated trip through the tow yard, one of the attendants noticed a smell. It was strong enough to know this was above their pay grade. When authorities approached, what they found would begin a chain reaction, one that would travel far beyond that parking space. Inside the front trunk of the vehicle was the body of 14-year-old Celeste Hernandez. 14. Old enough to text friends, to post online, to admire someone older, too young to become a headline. Reports quickly noted who the vehicle allegedly belonged to, and within hours, the story was no longer about a quiet parking lot. It was about a name, a public figure, and questions that were suddenly everywhere. Law enforcement confirmed an investigation, but details were limited. Online speculation moved much, much faster than facts. But beneath the headlines, beneath the outrage, beneath the noise, there is a quieter question. Was this just a random event, or the culmination of intimate partner violence? Because relationship violence is often described as explosive. But what if it isn't? What if it builds? What if it tightens? What if it begins somewhere much quieter? Violence is often described as a flip of a switch in the moment, a flash of anger, a loss of control, a snap. It is easier to believe that. Because if violence is sudden, it feels isolated, detached from everything that came before it. But research tells a more complicated story. Many violent relationships do not begin with rage. They begin with structure. A dynamic, one that may look ordinary at first glance. Some relationships are built on mutuality, shared agency, and power. In mutual relationships, influence flows in both directions. Neither person must dominate to feel secure. But other relationships are built differently. They are structured around hierarchy. One person leads. One person follows. One sets the tone while the other adjusts. That does not automatically make a relationship abusive. Power imbalances exist everywhere, in age, in fame, in wealth, and in experience. But when dominance becomes the foundation of intimacy, something subtle shifts. Admiration can begin to replace equality. Dependence can begin to replace autonomy. And control can begin to feel like connection. This is where status psychology enters the conversation. Human beings are deeply sensitive to status. Across cultures, across societies, we track hierarchy almost instinctively. Status is not just social, it is psychological. And when status is threatened, the reaction is rarely calm. Researchers studying humiliation and status loss have found that perceived loss of dominance can trigger destabilization, particularly when identity is tied to control. When someone builds their sense of self around being admired, being needed, being superior, or being in control, losing that position can feel less like rejection and more like humiliation. So we have to ask, is violence always born from rage? Before we return to the specifics of this case, we need to understand the facts as they stand, clearly, carefully, and without speculation. As of now, the investigation remains ongoing. Law enforcement has confirmed that the body of 14-year-old Celeste Hernandez was discovered inside a vehicle allegedly associated with David. Authorities have not publicly released a full autopsy report. The official cause and manner of death have not been finalized in public documentation. Investigators have stated that the case is active. Court filings recently revealed that a grand jury investigation had been convened. According to reporting, court documents describe David as a target in that grand jury inquiry. It is important to emphasize, a grand jury investigation is not a conviction. At the time of this recording, no charges have been filed. In cases like this, the internet often moves faster than the courts. But here, we are going to slow down. Hello? This is Inquisitive. Here, we analyze high-profile events, examine the psychological and structural dynamics beneath the headlines, and separate mechanism from speculation. If that kind of analysis matters to you, consider subscribing. Today, we are examining how, when relationships are rooted in dominance rather than mutuality, violence can become a desperate attempt to preserve status. This video is not about accusation. It is not about sensationalism. It is about examining a pattern. Using what has been publicly reported in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case as a lens, we are going to explore a broader question. When dominance forms the foundation of intimacy, what happens when that dominance is threatened? To understand that, we need to begin with structure. To understand how relationships collapse, we first need to understand how they are built. Dominance, in psychological terms, is not simply aggression. It is hierarchy. It is the organization of power between two individuals. Who sets the terms? Who adjusts? Social dominance theory suggests that human beings are deeply attuned to hierarchy. Across cultures and social systems, status structures emerge naturally. In romantic relationships, dominance can appear in subtle forms, one partner consistently making decisions, one partner controlling access to resources, to attention, to social circles, one partner shaping the narrative of what is acceptable. This does not automatically mean abuse. Dominance can exist without violence, but dominance changes the foundation of intimacy. In mutual relationships, influence flows both directions. Disagreement does not threaten identity. But in dominance-based relationships, power is not shared. It is maintained. And maintenance requires reinforcement. If one person's identity becomes tied to being admired, needed, or superior, then autonomy from the other person can feel like a disruption. In research on relational control, scholars note that individuals who rely heavily on dominance for relational security may experience heightened distress when that dominance is challenged, not because they are inherently violent, but because the structure that holds their identity together begins to loosen. When intimacy is built on equality, independence strengthens the connection. When intimacy is built on hierarchy, independence threatens it. The question is, how? Dominance alone does not explain collapse. For collapse to occur, something has to shift. In status psychology, that shift is known as status threat. Status threat occurs when an individual perceives a loss of position, influence, admiration, or control within a hierarchy. The threat does not have to be real in objective terms. It only has to feel real. Neuroscientific research shows that threats to status activate many of the same stress pathways as physical danger. Heart rate increases. Defensiveness rises. Cognitive flexibility decreases. When status feels unstable, the brain does not interpret it as a minor inconvenience. It interprets it as risk. In relationships structured around mutuality, status shifts are manageable. But in relationships structured around dominance, status shifts are destabilizing. Researchers studying humiliation describe it as one of the most destabilizing social emotions. Humiliation combines exposure with powerlessness. And when humiliation intersects with dominance-based identity, the response can become defensive. Sometimes the defense is verbal. Sometimes it is emotional withdrawal. Sometimes it is escalation. It can begin with attempts to reassert control. The critical shift happens when restoration fails. In those cases, violence is not the beginning, it is the last attempt. If dominance establishes the hierarchy, and status threat destabilizes it, escalation is the response. Escalation is not chaos, it is strategy. In research on coercive control, escalation is described as a progressive tightening of influence when earlier methods fail. It rarely begins with overt violence. It begins with subtle adjustments. A question that sounds like concern. A suggestion framed as protection. A request that limits autonomy. At first, the changes are small. When those measures fail to restore hierarchy, the tightening continues. Escalation follows a pattern. Each stage represents an attempt to reassert dominance. Researchers studying intimate partner violence often note that the most dangerous period in a dominance-based relationship is not during control, it is during perceived loss of control. Not everyone escalates to violence. But when violence does occur in dominance-based relationships, it is often preceded by a tightening. We have discussed dominance. We have discussed status threat. We have discussed escalation. Now we need to address something specific to this case. Because this was not a relationship between equal adults. This involved a 14-year-old. And when adolescence enters the equation, the power structure changes dramatically. Developmentally, teenagers are still forming their identity. Their prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and risk assessment, is still developing. Admiration, validation, and belonging carry heightened psychological weight during adolescence. Now add another layer. Celebrity. When one person holds public influence, social capital, and admiration at scale, the hierarchy expands. A celebrity is not simply older. They are elevated. They hold innate narrative power. They hold obvious social authority. They hold heightened symbolic value. For a teenager, admiration toward a celebrity can feel intense, consuming, and deeply validating. In that dynamic, mutuality becomes difficult to establish, because one person enters the relationship already positioned above the other in social hierarchy. This does not automatically mean exploitation occurs, but it does mean the foundation is uneven, and uneven foundations are vulnerable to dominance patterns. Online, many have used the word grooming. It is a heavy word, and it should not be used lightly. In psychological research, grooming refers to a process in which an older or more powerful individual gradually builds trust, emotional dependence, and isolation in order to establish control over a younger or more vulnerable person. Grooming is not defined by a single act. It is defined by pattern. Gradual normalization, dependency formation. Again, we are not declaring that grooming occurred. We are acknowledging that when analyzing a relationship involving a minor and a significantly more powerful individual, grooming dynamics cannot be ignored as a theoretical possibility. If we place this case within the framework we've built, dominance, status threat, and escalation, certain structural realities come into focus. And if the speculation in this case ultimately proves to be true, the framework we've examined suggests something important. The most volatile moment in a dominance-based relationship is not the beginning. It is the moment dominance becomes unsustainable. Here at Inquisitive, we separate speculation from structure and headlines from psychology. If you value careful analysis over frenzy, subscribe. As this case develops, we will continue examining not just what happens, but why.